start webinar. Okay.
Webinar is now live.
All right.
You're on, Arnika.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Arnika Dawkins, Chair of APAD Education Committee, presenter of APAD Talks. APAD brings together prominent curators, artists, collectors, and writers to discuss thought-provoking ideas, new trends, and unique processes involved in the medium of photography. APAD Talks start conversations that lead to understanding, inspiration, and action. On behalf of APAD, members of APAD, welcome to today's talk. Fotoclubismo, Brazilian Modernist Photography, 1946 to 1964, will be presented by Sarah Meister and Heloisa Espada, and explores the unforgettable creative achievements of Sao Paulo's Foto-Cine, Clube, Bandeirante, a group of amateur photographers whose ambition and innovative works embodied the abundant originality of post-war Brazilian culture. Although their works was widely heralded by other artists, particularly in the 1950s, this is the first major museum exhibition to present this fascinating moment in photography's history to audiences outside of Brazil. Our speakers today are Sarah Meister, curator in the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art. In May 2021, Sarah Meister will become the Executive Director of Aperture. She has been a curator in the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art since 2009, where most recently she organized Dorothea Lange, Words and Pictures. Other recent publications and projects have considered the work of Gordon Parks, Luigi Ghirri, and Frances Benjamin Johnston. Heloisa Espada has been curator of Moreira Salles Institute Brazil since 2008 and obtained a PhD in history at the University of Sao Paulo in 2011. She works with Brazilian modern and contemporary art, specializing in photography. In 2016, she published the book Monumentality and Shadow, the representation of Brasilia's Civic Center by Marcel Gotaho. Among the shows that she organized at IMS are Geraldo De Barros and Photography, Conflict, Photography, and Political Violence in Brazil, 1889 to 1954, and Peter Schreier Archives, this past year in 2020. Thank you all for joining us today. Feel free to engage with our speakers by utilizing the chat box. We will also have a Q&A at the end of the discussion, and with no further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Sarah Meister, followed by Heloisa Espada.
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much, Arnika. So if you'll give me a moment, I'm going to do my best to share my screen and a PowerPoint, which is not my natural mode. So thank you for, I'm going to press present, and then we should be all good, I think, except I can't get to the present. 1 minute. There we go. Present. How's that? Heloisa, does it look good?
It's great.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much to Arnika Dawkins, to APAD. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to present this exhibition to you all, to Roland and to Nicole for behind the scenes making everything go smoothly. This is a very, anyway, I like that I'm being trusted with the host capacity. MoMA doesn't let me do that usually. I'd also like to thank Marcela Brandemarti from Utopica Gallery in Sao Paulo, because it was really Marcela's idea to bring forward this exhibition as part of the APAD talks. And Marcelo and Pablo De Julio have been, also of Utopica, have been very instrumental in my research throughout this. So thank you all. And without further ado, I'm going to start with a little story. So this is a photograph of a young man named Thomas Farkas on his wedding day. And Farkas was a very precocious filmmaker and photographer, a Hungarian immigrant living in Sao Paulo, whose parents operated a photography shop there. Now, in 1948, he was in love with a young woman named Melanie, and his parents were not so keen on that arrangement. And so they sent him to the United States in the hopes that it would cool his affections for her. As you can see here, in March of 1949, that effort failed. He returned to Sao Paulo at the end of 1948. He married Melanie in March 1949, and the wedding was recorded in the Boletim of the Foto-Cine Club Bandeirante. So here are his fellow Bandeirante members holding their cameras and tripods in a ceremonial arch at the end of the ceremony. However, the trip was not all for naught, even from his parents' perspective. He met with Edward Weston in California. He met with Edward Steichen in the US. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that this is one of 7 photographs that Farkas sent to the United States in January of 1949 to Steichen at MoMA after his visit. And these are really the foundation of the exhibition that we're putting up now. As I mentioned, Farkas was also a filmmaker. He brought back several experimental films by Maya Deren to Sao Paulo. And that summer winter in Sao Paulo, summer in New York, that July, he had a one-person exhibition at the Modern Art Museum in Sao Paulo that included this and other works. He was exhibited twice by Edward Steichen at MoMA, once in 1951 in an exhibition called Abstraction in Photography, again in 1959 in an exhibition of work from the museum collection. And yet, despite all of this, by the around 2012, there was really 6 out of the 7 works by Farkas were actually languishing in the study collection and hadn't been promoted to the real museum collection, although we've taken care of that since then. And it's just remarkable given the prominence and the depth of the connection that this work and so many others have been so overlooked for so long outside of Brazil. So this kind of inventive, original photograph, and I hope we will ask Heloisa Espada to talk about this, her foundational research and the research of Eloise Costa in particular have both been so important to me. Most of it is in Portuguese, which is my loss. But the two of them have been incredible thought partners with me over the last 8 years as I've been learning about this work. So this is an incredible work by Geraldo De Barros, about whom Eloise published an incredible book and accompanying exhibition. So I'm going to leave this to her. But it is astounding to me that this work of this level of originality, of invention, was just truly overlooked outside of Brazil for so long. So the photographers who were members of the Foto-Cine Club Bandeirante, or FCCB, as those non-Portuguese speakers, it's easier to say, such as this one, they were part of a vast international network of amateur photographers. And what we mean by amateurs here, the word is used in very different ways throughout the history of photography. There were the gentleman amateurs, let's say like Fox Talbot in England, for whom photography and many arts were just a part of a gentleman's education. There's the amateur that we think about when we think of the millions of people wielding a Kodak camera starting in the late 1880s.
It's raining.
Sorry? Okay. There's the amateur photographers of Instagram today, but these amateurs are on that spectrum, which means that they held day jobs. They were doctors, they were lawyers, they were bankers, and electricians, all sorts of professions. And photography was a hobby. It was something that they pursued in the evenings and on the weekends, and it was not how most of them earned their living. Now, of course, this is not to diminish the seriousness with which they approached this hobby. And it wasn't just MoMA in the 1950s who admired the work of the FCCB members. They were awarded prizes in 6 continents around the world. The club would send prints to various amateur salons. So they were part of this vast dynamic network. but they were also engaged with the full artistic community that was active in Sao Paulo at the time. So as I mentioned, Thomas Farkas had a show at MOM, the Modern Art Museum there. There was another modern art museum called MASPI, which is of course still also like MOM, very active today. And then of course, starting in 1951, there was the Sao Paulo Biennial, which in 1953, in its second iteration, had a broad display of work by Foto-Cine Club members. So I also hope that Heloisa will tell us a little bit about that when she speaks. But these so-called amateurs were deeply engaged with the artistic innovation, with the architecture, with the pace and life of Sao Paulo at that time. There were also a very solid number of female members, and some of these members were wives or sisters or cousins of other FCCB members, but others like Maria Elena Valente de Cruz joined on her own. And I would argue that the women maybe contributed to the collegial or even familial atmosphere of the club. They went on excursions together, they studied together, they listened to lectures together, they had they had monthly seminars where they would discuss and critique one another's work. And this leads to an interesting part of the FCCB experience, which is that they were fiercely competitive, both amongst themselves, trying to really make the best picture possible, but also fighting for their position on the international stage and succeeding in that in many ways. But one of the challenges for me was to grapple with the fact that alongside the work, like the ones I just showed you, which were all from the museum collection, work of such invention, of such originality, they also made a fair number of pictures of kittens and misty landscapes and little girls, cute girls and metaphorically rich images like you see here that were all featured on the cover of the club's monthly bulletin. And one of the things that's been a challenge for me to grapple with is, on what basis do I make the judgment that the previous pictures I showed you are ones that I will stand by on an artistic level? And how, for these, can I declare that I think that they are so hopelessly cliched that they are thus less interesting and not in the museum collection or in the exhibition? And one of the answers to that is that the club's own sense of criticality that you can understand when you read the bulletin carefully is really central to this. So this is an example of a papeleta, or a scorecard, that they would use to analyze and evaluate one another's works according to excellent, good, fair, or poor. And this is a pretty straightforward activity when you think of focus and lighting and composition. But you'll note that on the bottom half of this, more than half of the factors are what they call factor psicologico, or psychological factors. And surely we can agree that those are harder to assign such grades to understand. So what did I do? Well, with the help of several people that if you forgive me for naming, and we did our homework. And so relying on the scholarship, as I mentioned, of Heloisa Espada and Eloise Costa and others in Brazil, and also working at MoMA with a 12-month intern named Chie Higashi, who actually was formerly worked for Heloisa, and two 12-month Museum Research Consortium fellows, Abigail Lappin-Dardashti and Liz Donato. We dug into all of the evidence we could find to understand more about the club, about their priorities, and about their own systems of judgment, so that we could hold those up against our own. So here's the cover of the book that we are so delighted is coming out really any day now. The front is a photograph by Gertrudis Altschul. The back is one by Gaspar Gasparian. And I should acknowledge that there are two ways in which COVID has had a pretty serious impact on this project. One is that the book initially had 7 outside authors, including Heloisa Espada. And unfortunately, because of COVID, we reduced the scale, and I am the primary author of the book. But it's one of the reasons I'm so excited to be speaking today with Heloisa, to hear her thoughts, because she is really much more of an expert than I. I'm also sharing with you, whoops, I think I skipped, yeah. Okay, the structure of the book and of the exhibition takes the club's monthly seminars as a point of departure. So they would name a theme, and those themes would be something like experimental processes or nocturnes or architecture or anything like that. And those themes allow me to bring in the work of many, many different members of the Foto-Cine Club. And those bookend monographic considerations of 6 different individuals' work, Geraldo De Barros being one. So this is an example of a spread from the book that shows the back of one of the prints, and you can see how it was circulating around the world to Southampton, Weston-super-Mare, and other places. So the prints are traveling around the world, picking up stamps and labels. But the exhibition and the book are structured like this, with a thematic leading into a monographic and then another thematic display. Now, the book has 6 of these sections. The exhibition has only 3, because another consequence of COVID was that we made the difficult but essential decision to eliminate the international loans. And what that means is that the exhibition at MoMA, while the book, fortunately, we were very lucky, was all printed before this changed, has everything, the exhibition really privileges the work that's in the museum collection. On some level, this makes me happy because it shows the institutional commitment to the work. So the museum has been collecting this work with the help of many people in Brazil and around the museum. And so all of these recent acquisitions are going to be featured here, and as they have been actually in past exhibitions at MoMA as well. And so I'll just conclude this little sneak preview. The exhibition opens on May 8th. Saturday, May 8th. I hope that as many of you as possible are able to see it. If not, as I mentioned, the book has even more in it than are in the exhibition. So that's another wonderful way. But to me, this is a photograph made on one of the excursions that the club made. And they traveled by bus, but every once in a while they went by plane, and they proudly carried their banner. And I would say that then and now, photography was and is a wonderful means of connecting people. And the experience of trying to recuperate this amateur practice and really reevaluate the status of the amateur today is a model that I hope can be used to look more broadly and think what other practices may have been overlooked and for what reasons, and what can we as photo historians do to address those lapses. So thank you for listening, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I hope. There we go. And now we'll go back, and I see Heloisa. So now it all feels well to me. Hi, Heloisa.
Hello. Thank you, Sarah.
Where are you now? Why don't you tell everyone?
Are you listening well?
I can hear. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Good evening. I would like to thank to Arnica Dawkins and Sarah Meister, as well as Pablo Di Giulio and Marcela Brandimarte from the Brazilian Gallery Utópica for the invitation to be here with you today. The production of the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirante started to be studied in Brazil in 1985, when 2 young researchers, Heloisa Costa and Renato Rodrigues, received a national grant to develop an unedited research about Brazilian modern art. Up to that moment, very few people know about the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirante. That was not a subject in the Brazilian art history, neither in the scholar milieu. Heloisa Costa and Renato Rodrigues' work was published for the first time only a decade after, in 1995, 10 years after, as the book A Fotografia Moderna no Brasil, The Modern Photography in Brazil, that became a fundamental and unavoidable material about Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes. I'm sorry for my poor English.
No, by the way, I love hearing you pronounce things in Portuguese because it just gives me my goal of like, that's how I need to say it. So please.
No, I ask your patience, but okay. The book is focused in the history of the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirante and in the purpose to rescue its members' productions, but with the time and without the intention of the authors, the book became a synonym of the modern photography in Brazil, mainly because it was the first scholar work to put this subject seriously on the table. I have some reasons to suspect of a straight correspondence between the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes productions and the idea of an emergence of the modern photography in Brazil. Or maybe it would be more accurate to say that the association between the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes and the emergence of the modern photography in Brazil may take us to a simplistic and limited interpretation regarding the challenge to understand the specificities of the modern art and the modern photography in Brazil, in my opinion. Well, I will try to explain to you better my point of view here. First of all, it's essential to consider that between the 1920s and 40s, most of the Brazilian modern artists was far from photography, far from abstraction and other experimental practices. They are more linked to painting, sculpture, and drawing in a very traditional way. So when a formalist conception of modern photographies arrives in Brazil, in Brazilian art milieu, I mean, or better to say in the Southeast artistic milieu, because it's important to always think that Brazilian is a absurd large country, and it's like in the United States when you talk about the East reality, the West realities sometimes are very different contexts. So everything that we are talking about here is about the Southeast artistic milieu. Well, in late 40s, it comes through the Fotoclubismo that had been out of the artistic circuit up to the 50s. So during the 30s and 40s, the formal features of the European and North American modern photography, I mean bird's eye view and worm's eye view, close-ups, and the tendency to abstraction, for instance, appeared in Brazil first through the photojournalism in the context of the O Cruzeiro magazine, that was a kind of Brazilian version of Life, the North American Life. And these features were introduced by, in Brazilian press, mainly by European photographers who immigrated to the country in the context of the Second World War, such as Jean Manzon, Pierre Verger, Hildegard Rosenthal, and Marcel Goderot, among others. Their work started to spread a kind of photographic image that would reach the members of the Fotoclubismo in a wide way. During the 40s and mainly in the 50s, this kind of modern visuality reached the advertisement as well. The Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes was a club of amateur photographers, as Sarah showed us, created in 1939. The club grew up in number of members and in terms of importance, mainly with the end of the Second World War. It coincides with an important expansion of Brazilian industrial and economic growth, what could be seen mainly through a strong process of urbanization. It was after 1945 that São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro turned in truly metropolis, big cities, receiving people from all parts of the country in search of employment. This economic and social development transformed decisively the art milieu of these two big cities as well. Between 1947 and 1949, people watched the creation of the Museum of Modern Art of São Paulo, the Museum of Modern Art of Rio de Janeiro, and the Museum of São Paulo, best known as MASP. And, you know, in 1951, the biennial of the Museum of Modern Art of São Paulo, on that time, it was not only biennial of São Paulo, was inaugurated with the goal to present the international modern production largely in Brazil, including abstraction that was very hard in Brazilian art scene up to that date. The 40s and 50s witnessed the international publicizing of Brazilian modern architecture as well, mainly through the personality of Oscar Niemeyer. And at the same time, the Brazilian modern architecture became a reality in the urban centers as São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Belo Horizonte, for instance. Another thing to consider is that, as you know, the post-war was also a time to rescue and recover the European avant-garde art that had been banned by Nazis and fascists during the war. In Germany, for instance, in 1951, the German photographer Otto Steiner organized the first edition of the exhibition Subjective Photography in Saarbrücken, which included individual shows of Man Ray, Moholy-Nagy, and Herbert Reed for the first time after the war in Germany. How these national and international events were crucial to the expansion of the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes in the 50s in São Paulo, and for the adoption of a modern photographic aesthetics by most of its members. I see that the importance of the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes may be scaled mainly by the realization of the international exhibition of photographic art that was organized by the club in a municipal gallery in downtown in São Paulo. For instance, in 1949, this show, it was an annual show. In 49, it had been visited by 100,000 people, according to the bulletin that was the magazine published by the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes. It's difficult to confirm this number, but it's an information that is in the magazine. The Brazilian club became an active member of in this period of the International Federation of Photographic Art, best known as FIAP. That was an international association based in Switzerland that created an important web of relations among photo clubs in all continents after the end of the Second War. The New Yorker scholar Elizabeth Fintaylor has shown that the creation of FIAP and its ideal to connect photographers all over the world through an international language. It was their goal, the understanding about photography, that it was an international language. was related with the creation of institutions that appeared after in 1945, like with the goal to promote international understandings and collaboration, such as ONU and UNESCO. So the same idea to connect people all over the world in a friendly way, in a idea to exchange experiences and to share productions and feelings and experiences. So back into Brazilian context, the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirante presented photographies made by amateur photographers from all parts of the world in this international exhibition of photographic art, this annual show that I mentioned, and published texts by international authors in its bulletin. As a result, during the 50s, the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirante's photographs fitted in an international style that had incorporated different tendencies. I can quote the formal features of the 20s avant-gardes, the photojournalism connected with a magnum aesthetic, photograms, etc. All of this was understood in a generic way, with a generic target of modern photography, or sometimes the expression of subjective feelings, subjective views. They are abstract photographs, and they are special attention to the new modern Brazilian constructions. I'm sorry, now I'm talking to Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirante's production. They are abstract photographs, and they are special attention to the new modern Brazilian constructions, reflected the ascension of the concrete art and the ascension of modern Brazilian architecture as well. So I'm finishing. It's very important to recognize that Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes had a central role to bring photography close to the museums and close to the art milieu in Sao Paulo during the 50s, mainly during the 50s. I mean, that I think that is the 50s were the most important time in the history of the club. On the other hand, it's important to know that in the 50s, this wide idea of modern photography was far from the idealistic and utopic goals to transform women and men proposed by constructivist Russian artists, for instance, or proposed by Bauhaus in the 20s. Even though we recognize the several achievements of the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes, I think that is very important. Don't idealize and don't romanticize it. Although I recognize the realizations and the importance of the club in Sao Paulo milieu, artistic milieu, in terms of the history of modern photography in Brazil, when I think about the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes, I think about an ambiguous phenomenon, about a kind of pacified modernism, because it seems to me that in Brazil, the largest recognition of the forms of the modern photography as they had been manifested by European and North American avant-gardes in the 20s coincides with the accommodation of this kind of visuality. The things comes together, I see. And I mean that the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes production is not related with any kind of risk or innovation in terms of sensibility, but it's about to accompany a visual tendency put on the table by the opening of the modern museums in late 40s, by the first biennial in 51, by the emergency of abstraction and Brazilian modern architecture in the 40s and the 50s. The Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes was, above all, in my view, a social club, as Sarah showed, that gathered middle-class amateurs interested in enlarge their connections with the world and interested in exercise their creativity, visual creativity from photograph. But their aesthetics were not committed or worried with open new ways to the art or to the sensibility. I think it was not about avant-garde, but it was not more about sociability and about road tendency and Brazilian tendency as well. Thank you.
So thank you, Heloisa. That is so, first of all, I appreciate all what you're saying. And I think the caution against not idealizing or romanticizing I did not use the term avant-garde, just to be clear, because I agree with both you and Eloise Costa has also pointed out of like making sure that you're applying the right critical model to this work, because it is the factor of a whole host of artistic and social and other factors. And you know, one of the distinction between FIAP or the relationship between FIAP, the Fédération Internationale of Art Photographique that you mentioned, and the FCCB, I thought a lot about the connection between them, because on some level, FIAP also exhibited the whole tendencies, the kittens and the misty landscapes, and the work that adopted a sort of avant-garde language, but not necessarily with the same utopic impulse that you were talking about with the constructed. And I think one of the reasons that the exhibition is structured the way it is that we have to deal with the thorny fact that in photography, it is possible for a technically competent amateur to imitate the look of something that is not the same thing as true artistic innovation or expression. And one of the reasons that we have certain photographers like Germán Lorca or Geraldo De Barros or others that we look at them in depth to understand what is the distinctive nature of their efforts, as opposed to dozens and dozens and dozens of other members who may have just made one really great picture that I love, you know, Giulio Agostinelli, no offense to Giulio Agostinelli, but that may be the best picture he ever made. So part of the challenge for me is to try to find the balance between saying the criticality of this group overall, I think, is what helps them stand apart from many of the other members of FIAP. And because they really did, you know, they're bringing Valdemar Cordero, they're bringing Mario Pedrosa into the club to really engage with ideas in a way that is distinctive and important. And I think that's, but I also wanted to say one thing about the dates of the exhibition, 1946 to 1964. 46 was, as you mentioned, 7 years after the club was founded, but that was when the bulletin was first published. So that seemed like, for political reasons in Brazil, for practical reasons, that was really the beginning, as you said, of the flowering of this activity. 1964 is a little trickier, because I agree with you, it was waning, the energy of the club was waning before then. But we put 64 as the end for the exhibition because that was the beginning of a dictatorship in Brazil, that what hadn't been squashed for other reasons was reasonably. But I was wondering, do you, before we turn to the questions from other people, to what do you attribute the waning of this? Meaning they really were incredibly well known all over the world in the 1950s. And yet the recuperative efforts that you were talking about of Eloise Costa and Renato Rodrigues da Silva, you know, how could they be so forgotten even within Brazil? Oops, you're still muted. Okay.
It's a very interesting question. Actually, I just want to make clear that I'm talking as a Brazilian art historian, and I'm always worried about to think about, and I'm very committed and worried to think about the specificities of our modernization, and not only about modern and modern appearance, but what means modernism and modernity in Brazil. Because we are, you know, it was the last country in the world to abolish slavery. And it's a very complicated society, very large country with different realities, and it's always very complicated to talk in name of Brazil, since like it's in the United States, you know. So when I talk and when I think about Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes, I'm worried to, I think in a wide perspective, trying to understand what means in this society, in this moment of Brazil. It's, your question is related with this, because in Brazil, the history of photography, actually, I can say that we can say that it began to be written in late 70s. We had some written before, most of them about 19th century photography, but it's something that we are constructing, actually. And the book, it's totally important and remarkable and fundamental, the launch, the publish of the book, the modern photography in Brazil, by Heloisa Costa and Renato Rodrigues. They were in charge to put this question on the table, to bring us to this theme. As I told, before this book, nobody knows. But when they began this work, this research, it was 1985, the end of the dictatorship times. Mm-hmm. And we have very few opportunities to publish books about photography, books about art in Brazil. Their book was financed by Funarte, that was a federal artistic institution. And only in 2000.
By the way, I just want to make sure no one misses that point. Their original research was funded by the government, was a research grant, right? So to yes. think, I mean, we have nothing like that in the United States. So it's just worth.
Yes, and I want to say that our condition to construct a history of art, or art history, history of photography, are till nowadays very precarious. So it's totally astonishing, their work, and important. But on the other hand, since it became a kind of thought and unquestionable true about Brazilian modern photography. So this is what upset me in some time, because I think that it would be more important for our reality, for in this moment, even considering that this is very important moment, that this production will be seen in MoMA, at MoMA. For me, I understand that we need to look to our production without trying to look to find a formal modernist result, because it doesn't help me too much to think about what was the modernity in Brazil. It's about this.
That's interesting.
Sorry.
I mean, I think it's interesting because I fancy that I come to this work. It has forced me to confront things that are as inescapable and unavoidable as taste. Why do I like what I like? And why do I not like the pictures? I mean, I like kittens, no offense to any kitten lovers out there, but why do I find that certain work in the FCCB, in this umbrella, is less original, less interesting, more cliched than others? And part of the answer to that is acknowledging where you come from as a human being. And I think that this is in part what interests me about the work that I've been doing, thanks to you and thanks to Heloisa Costa, is to make a framework through which you can both acknowledge your personal likes and dislikes and make a claim or do your research, do your homework to say, this is where this fits in and this is my hypothesis for why it has been so overlooked. And I would say amateur practices in general, FIAP in general, tend to be imitative, meaning they pick a model that would win prizes and they do things according to that model. And even the FCCB in the bulletin, they're wringing their hands about, well, if we're too original, then we're not going to win the prizes because, and they want desperately to win the prizes on the international stage. And so coming to terms with this, I think is really interesting, but I think I also, we won't get into it now, but like the kind of work that's not in the FCCB that was a part of modernism in Brazil is also really interesting. So, the O Cruzeiro photography, it wasn't that this was everything that was happening in Brazil at the time. This club was sort of one group. So, but now I'm feeling like it's 3:47 and I've been neglecting questions. So, I'm going to,
So Sarah, there's
okay.
6 questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
This is Roland. This is incredible. This is an incredible lecture. I'm so grateful to be part of it. So there's 6 questions in Q&A, but I also wanted to, maybe you should address about the book because that came up in the the chat box a little bit. And then there was also another point that came up in the chat box about a list of the women photographers. So if you could cover those 2 points, then we could go through the Q&A.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. I love a little guidance. Okay. So the book is called Fotoclubismo, British. No, nothing to do with Britain. I'm sorry. It's called Fotoclubismo, Brazilian Modernist Photography. And the book title also includes "And the Foto-Cine Club Bandeirante." But the exhibition does not have that part. 1946 to 1964. But because all of that is difficult, if you Google Fotoclubismo MoMA, you'll find it. That was why we worked so hard to find a title, because it has to be something that somebody can search.
So it makes sense.
That, and I believe that it's available. I saw someone say that the MoMA website, you can't ship it to Brazil, and I'm sorry. Heloisa, maybe we'll work with Instituto Moreira Salles to try to get some copies there so that they can be shipped within Brazil. So sorry about the Brazil shipping, but we'll work on that. And the women photographers, there are 40 photographers that we are featuring in the MoMA exhibition. There are thousands of photographers who were members of the club. The club exists today and is still very active. They have also been very helpful to me in my research. So I can't off the top of my head list all 40, plus I would butcher their names so terribly that Heloisa would start to cry in hearing me say their names in English. So, so we'll, all of their names will be,
Don't worry.
but all of the names will be up soon. So, so they'll be on MoMA's website, and we can also maybe post them to Facebook. We can just post a list, Roland. Would that be nice to this?
We could do that. We could go ahead and get that coordinated. So if you and I want to connect after this or another day, we can pull all that information together and have that up on Facebook for them.
We appreciate people who are interested in good research, so we want to encourage that.
So a question came back up real quick about the book at Amazon. It says it's pre-order. Is that correct? Does that sound right?
Yes. I have one hand-bound copy, but I can't even send one to Heloisa yet. So we're coming soon. They are printed and bound, though, so not too long.
No problem. So if we go to Q&A, the first question is from Colleen Mullins, and it came in at 3:20. So if you want to know which the two of you. Yep.
So Colleen asked, I know many South American works were deaccessioned, paintings, I think, at SF MoMA along the way, having been collected by early by its first director, sold by later ones. I think you mean MoMA, New York MoMA, not SF MoMA. And you may mean work that Alfred Barr collected. I would say that the museum is very conscious of not deaccessioning according to geographic concerns. So that would never be a criteria for deaccessioning. The other part of the question is that what other American museums collected the FCCB? And Heloisa, correct me if I'm wrong, but other than Geraldo De Barros, who's in a handful of collections. Whoops, you just muted yourself. One more time.
You're muted.
Heloisa, one more time, you're muted. Stay unmuted. Will you chime in all the time?
The Museum of the Museum of Fine Art, Houston.
Yeah.
Must have paintings, of course, but must have photographs.
FCCB members. I think they have some Geraldo De Barros, but I don't think they have.
No. Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirante, no, but Geraldo De Barros, probably some photographs.
Yeah. But very few.
I think that because Geraldo De Barros, since he was a part of the concrete art movement, and actually he was part of many other artistic groups, and so it's more common to see him in the collections. But the other ones, no. I know that Tate Modern owns some of by maybe Gaspar Gasparian and maybe
a handful. Yeah, the Tate has a handful that they exhibited in the abstract photography show, but anyway, not many. Certainly outside of Brazil, none like MoMA's. So I'll say it makes it a little easier for me to think about leaving the museum knowing that I'm leaving those photographs behind, because they have, in addition to this exhibition, Star Figura and I included them in Making Space, Women Artists and Postwar Abstraction, 10 works by Gertrudis Altschul. And Quentin Bajac did a gallery of abstract practices in the inaugural reinstallation, and a handful of the works were there too. So they will live on actively at MoMA, I'm sure. So there was another question about other serious camera clubs thriving for decades. And I would say I am deeply interested in amateur practices. In fact, I just got an email the other day from Robert McNeil's daughter talking about the amateur club that he was active in Washington, D.C. before and after the Second World War. So I think, amateur practices, part of the challenge is to look at them individually, to say there are some that are really, really great. But I think it's also important to remember that, like Heloisa was saying about trying to differentiate, when I look at the North American participants in the FCCB salons in Sao Paulo, I've never heard of one of them. The most famous one is Ray Meese. And I would argue that I don't have a colleague at any museum in North America who knows Ray Meese's work. He was based in Wisconsin, if that helps anyone. But so I think the important thing is to look closely and to see where there's really, sorry, do you want to chime in, Heloisa?
No, finish. I want to
I think the important part is to look closely. In other words, commercial practices, amateur practices, all of these are good ways that need to be reevaluated in order to tell more diverse histories of the medium. But that doesn't mean that they're all the same. So, yeah.
So we're fine with time. I know that the next couple of questions are a little lengthy. So 2 and 3, I don't.
Don't worry, I'll keep track. I promise, Roland.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you.
Did you want to chime in about the amateur?
No, I'm just looking here. There is a question about Edward Weston. If it's.
Oh yeah, do you want to answer that?
Yes, actually not pictures in the exhibitions, not pictures by Edward Weston, but there was in the 50s, I don't know, maybe 1951, there is a text in Bulletin about his work, and of course it was sometimes he was quoted. People knows his work, and it's important to say that actually the FCCB had a library, and they were in contact, and they know this production. Of course, sometimes they quote Paul Strand and Mulholland Nagy and this artist is international.
Yeah, they were in the bulletin a lot. So I'd like to turn to Alex Batista's question. He said, MoMA's been acquiring images of Brazilian modernist photographers for how long? Well, if you count Thomas Farkas, since 1949. But because that's really such an anomaly, the first works for which I was responsible for bringing into the collection came in 2014. So different time periods, but mostly in the last 6 or 7 years. And Stephen Perloff asked, in the US, we know most about modernist photography in Argentina and Brazil. How much of the flourishing of photography in those places, as opposed to the rest of South America, was due to the relative wealth of those countries? And while interconnected with that, communication and connections with American and European and North American photographers and artists. And do you know much about modernist photography communities in other South American countries? So I think, Stephen, first of all, you bring up a really important point that I neglected to make earlier, which is that economics have a lot to do with this. And if we're being honest, if you had money to pursue photography as an amateur, as a part of the Foto-Cine Club, you had disposable income. You were comfortable in your, you could spend money making big prints. You could spend money on the excursions and other social activities. So this was not, I don't want to pretend that this was, at least in the FCCB, anything other than that. In my essay in the book, I talk about Brazilian photography. I talk about the related clubs in Buenos Aires and in Mexico City, because those are the two other places where I was able to do sufficient research to dig into it in enough depth to talk about it with any kind of authority. But I do know that there were amateur clubs in Chile and Uruguay and Peru. So it's not, I wouldn't say that these are in Medellin in Colombia, actually, so there are many others. And in part, the goal for younger art historians, I think, is to look for and bring forward some of these other practices that may have been equally overlooked. But certainly economic stability is a precursor to being able to do this, to found modern art museums, but not only Buenos Aires and Rio and Sao Paulo, would I say. Do you agree, Heloisa?
Sorry, I was
Okay. You agree enough.
So Sarah, in the chat, someone kind of tagged something that coincides with what you just said. They asked about, like, when did you get the interest for the Brazilian work? And was someone specific who introduced you to the work, or just your visionary feeling as a curator saw the importance of this work?
Okay. I deserve no credit without mentioning Eloise Costa and Heloisa Espada and many, many other people in Brazil who have been so generous with me, with helping me understand this, with dealers, with collectors, with curators, with artists. Really, all of these have been helpful. Where I will say, when you get to see the book and you come to see the exhibition, you will see the work is amazing, and its absence from any history I had ever studied, I found just completely egregious. So it was thrilling, in fact, to find a chapter of photographic history that I had never learned, that I'd been in the field for 20 years and never seen any of it. But I would say the research that my Brazilian colleagues did and this is what made all of this possible. And Joao, I see your question about other clubs and production. I will say, I think the FCCB really is unique, and really unique actually in Brazil and even around the world. I think it is quite simply the best amateur club operating in the 1950s anywhere. But we'll see if everyone else agrees.
Yes, I just would like to comment that, finish to saying that actually I think that it's important, and maybe you noted this in your research, that actually for whom is interested in this production, I think it's important to see and to watch and try to understand individual practices and trajectories, because I think that some of them, for instance, Geraldo De Barros, it's not comparable, for instance, with Gasparian in many senses. Even Thomas Farkas has another, after he had another importance, another size in Brazilian culture that is not only related with the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes. And I think that some of them, and I would be able to quote some of them, were more restricted their importance to the importance of the Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes. So, as a scholar, I have to tell this, that it's difficult to me to think about the FCCB Club, and it's not about a question of taste. Actually, I think they are wonderful, beautiful in terms of visuality. And I don't deny this, but I think that it's important to say that Foto-Cine Clube Bandeirantes phenomenon is something. Geraldo De Barros' work and trajectory shouldn't be confunded with...
I totally agree. Yeah. And this is why, yeah. Okay, keep going.
And I think that it's more nuanced, but some of these works, beautiful works, only exists because of the rules and because of the concourse proposed by the Photo Clube.
Yeah.
So many of that pictures doesn't exist if they don't do an internal concourse about shapes and lights.
Yeah, I totally agree. Right. So I think actually maybe this is a good place to end, is to say this exhibition is filled, I would say, with certain artists who have an originality and an artistic vision and impact, each one distinct from one another, all of whom, like your Geraldo De Barros book, like the work that Heloisa has done on Thomas Farkas, deserved to be understood in their individual context. But many others just made interesting pictures as a part of the milieu of the club, which is not to say that they are artists of the same order. It's merely to say that they made a picture because of the shadow competition, the shadow theme, and they made a great photograph of a shadow. And this is one of the thorny things about photography that I love, is that, with one picture, a great artist can look like a very talented imitator with one picture. And it's over the course of a career that the great ones really distinguish themselves, I think. But I think your work on Geraldo De Barros certainly makes clear that he is of a very different order, and the FCCB was lucky that he cared to be associated with him. And it was an uneasy relationship, I would say, through and through.
Yes, it was not, and I'm not denying that it's a very important phenomenon and a very interesting phenomenon. I just think it's a little bit complicated, and it's part of my job to question it.
Mine as well. So I agreed. Thank you all for joining us. I'm sorry we went over and we didn't even get to answer all the questions, but we really appreciate. Thank you to Arnika and Nicole and Roland and Marcella, and especially to you, Heloisa. Thank you for doing this today with me.
Thank you for
everything.
My reflections and to share this. And Sarah, congratulations. I hope I'm able to visit the show.
Okay. We'll do a virtual one-on-one when we're installing, if not. All right. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And thanks again.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.